Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Joseph Lacey is Associate Professor of Political Theory at University College Dublin. He's about to embark on a 5-year project looking at the moral agency of participants in elections. That's politicians, special advisors, journalists and so on, but it's also you and me. People who engage with political messaging, perhaps take some interest in what's going on behind the scenes, and ultimately vote in elections. I met Joseph at his home in Dublin, where he was kind enough to host this podcast recording, and talked to him about his plans for the research, what's distinctive about the method he's going to use, and what he hopes to get out of it. Joseph, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great.
No problem. Okay, so you're concerned with the moral agency of stakeholders in political campaigns, right? So I was wondering, first of all, if you could kind of give us an idea of who are the stakeholders in political campaigns? So which stakeholders are you interested in?
Yeah, so the key stakeholders, the key actors are really those that I think are central to animating the electoral process. So you could pick a range of different actors here, but I think the ones that are really central are candidates, of course, political professionals, so campaign professionals, journalists, they mediate the message of the campaign, and then also citizens.
Okay, so it is potentially quite wide. So citizens, anybody voting in the election would count as a stakeholder as well. Yeah. And you're interested in those people's moral agency. So what do you mean by moral agency?
So moral agency, as I would understand it, relates to how responsible actors choose between courses of action based on competing normative values. So when you're studying the moral agency of a group of actors, you're looking for two things mainly. You're looking for patterns in their normative attitudes, right? So their normative attitudes towards particular issues, and patterns in their moral reasoning. So especially the values they use to justify their actions and their attitudes. Okay.
So just to take a little step back, so when you say normative attitudes, what do you mean by that?
So I basically mean the kind of the ideas they have concerning right or wrong, concerning particular kinds of campaign practices, particular kinds of duties they have in the campaign process. So if you're thinking about, for example, like micro-targeting, right? There might be this idea of, whereby campaigns now have the power to be able to target specific messages, often online, to specific types of voters, right? You might have certain normative attitudes towards that, like, is that an acceptable practice, or what kind of democratic norms does that enhance, or what kind of democratic norms might it undermine? Right? So your normative attitudes have to do with the values you hold and how those values how you use them to judge particular practices in the campaign domain, and particular kinds of behaviour in the campaign domain.
So is this essentially an empirical question then? You're concerned with how these stakeholders actually kind of reason about what they ought to do in the context of political campaigns, rather than kind of taking a normative stand yourself, in other words, saying how they actually ought to behave.
So really the project is both. So I think you can understand moral agency and also norms. You can understand them on the one hand as social facts, right? So which is just, how do people actually exercise their moral agency? How do they actually think about things, right? And their moral reasoning. But then, of course, there's also the idea of kind of morals from the perspective of moral philosophy, right? More objective ideas and concerning, whether it be a utilitarian framework or a deontological one or a character-based one, virtue ethics-based one. Yeah. And the project wants to do both, right? It wants to try to understand moral agency as a social fact, but to bring the moral agency of the actors into dialogue, right, into the discursive dialogue with what we hold as moral philosophers, or different ideas in moral philosophy. And in that respect, the project can be seen as what some authors have called a framework of grounded normative theory, right? So grounded normative theory is the overall approach to the project, and you can distinguish that from kind of what you might call applied ideal moral theory or applied ideal normative theory, right? And that kind of theory is basically, okay, so you have a set of standards, like a certain set of kind of, ideas concerning right and wrong. And if you were to approach this project, right, this idea of moral agency and campaigns, if you were to approach this from an ideal perspective, what you would do is you would get your normative principles, devise an ideal model as to what good campaign practices look like, and then you would judge the campaign behavior on the basis of those ideal standards.
Right.
Okay. Now, grounded normative theory is a different kind of approach to that, right? And it tries to start off with the textured experience of the moral agents themselves, how they experience their moral agency, and to bring that into dialogue, like I say, with these ideas of ideal moral normative theory. And the key intuition, the key idea really motivating this is the idea that the moral philosopher does not have a monopoly on morality. Okay, right. That the moral philosopher can and should try to learn and engage with the moral reasoning of actors who, because of their textured circumstances, may have unique insights, right? And they may have even knowing what the obstacles are, because like moral philosophy, of course, what our prescriptions change a lot often when circumstances change. Yeah. So if we can have a better idea of the texture of their moral experience, the personal obstacles, or the institutional obstacles, or the regulatory obstacles that may get in their way and that may shape how they think about things. Yeah. Well, then that's the sense in which we can I think really bring their moral agency into dialogue with wider ideas in moral philosophy, and then hopefully, get a kind of a more integrated understanding of moral agency that kind of has this kind of recursive kind of integrated interaction between these kind of two layers of thinking about moral agency.
That's really interesting and makes perfect sense, right? So there's kind of something potentially a bit arrogant about a moral philosopher coming along and saying, well, I'm going to work out completely independently of talking to anybody who actually engages in this stuff. I'm going to work out what they should be doing, and then I'm going to talk to them and find out what they are doing, and I'm going to match that against my kind of pre-existing moral standard, right? That does seem like a strange way of going about it.
Exactly, yeah. I think that's right. And I mean, I don't think we should by any means jettison the ideal standards and these kind of work in moral theory. Like, I think this is a great compass. It helps us to take a critical stance on and allows us, gives us the possibility of taking a critical stance on moral agents, right, and how they actually behave. Because if you just study moral agency as a social fact, as how they behave, then you get sucked into, well, this is just how things are. This is the moral justification, right? So at some point you do need these kind of critical standards, right? They are important, but to say that they are fixed in advance of knowing the texture is, I think, not the right way of, or not the best way of going about it. And that's why we have these kinds of it's a twofold kind of project in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like an excellent way of going about it, but potentially quite a complex and potentially quite tricky way of going about things as well, though, right? I mean, is this have you done previous projects with this kind of methodology?
Not as much. I mean, I think in some of my previous research, I've more taken an applied approach, right? So some of the applied work I've done before was like looking at the European Union and taking a set of democratic standards and applying those democratic standards to the institutions of the European Union and trying to kind of evaluate the extent to which it can be considered democratic. Right. And I think that's a bit of a safer approach when you're just looking at institutions. It's not, it has its shortcomings as well. But I think in particular when you're talking about situated actors, right, and in the context of those situations, this approach is particularly valuable. So, but the proof is going to be in the pudding of this, right? Yeah. So I mean, this will be my first foray into trying to use this methodology to really think about and challenge my own ideas as well about how these about these normative issues.
What kinds of difficulties or issues do you anticipate there might be in taking this kind of approach?
I mean, there are a few kind of, I guess some of the main issues I'm thinking of are kind of operational obstacles, right? So in terms of kind of actually getting access to these actors. But, on a more substantive level, I think the big issue might be just this idea that they have that we have in political science of desirability bias, right? Whereby people want to be perceived well,
right? Yeah.
By their by the person, because I'll be doing some surveys, but I'll be a lot of it will be interviews.
Yeah. Okay.
And how do you know that they're really talking about in an honest way about their moral reasoning? And particularly if there are problematic enterprises that they engage in, how are you going to unearth that? So I think the key thing is really about is really kind of the quality of the design here. So this is where I think the empirical research and qualitative methods can really help in this regard. And there are a few things you can do. There's I think one of the most important steps is to try to create a kind of a permissive environment, and that's kind of like the way in which you ask questions. So it's not kind of accusatory and when X happens, do you do this? Right? Yeah. It's more like some people in this situation may do this. What do you think about that? Right? Micro targeting is a new phenomenon in campaigns. Can you tell me, do you see any problems or advantages to this? Right? So you kind of give this kind of open framing, and then hopefully that's a way of kind of making these actors feel comfortable, not being judged, and so on. And in that way, I think you can, once you get their answers, and hopefully they will be honest answers, you can then be able to see kind of what kind of explicit and implicit patterns and moral ideas kind of emerge from this process. So I think the real kind of issue is trying to get an accurate picture of what the moral agency really is of these actors.
Yeah, really interesting. Could you go into a bit more depth about exactly what you're going to do? So you were talking about surveys and interviews there. So you're going to do some surveys, so some quantitative work, but then some qualitative surveys as well.
Yeah. So and the emphasis will really be on this kind of qualitative work. So like I said, the interviews with the elites, there will be mainly interviews, and then when it comes to citizens, we'll be doing some focus group work as well, right? Because the focus groups have the advantage of kind of pooling collective knowledge and attitudes, because unlike the elites who are professionals in the campaign environment, the citizens' ideas might be a bit hazier, and they might not be as au fait with some of the issues we really want to talk to them about. And so things like micro targeting, not every citizen might know exactly what that is, right? So in a focus group, you can kind of pose problems, and you can see how they think through these citizens think about them, how they think through in moral terms about these kinds of problems, and even their own duties and how they perceive their role in the campaign context. Right. So this is why we've chosen focus groups for this. And I should also say that there's a comparative dimension to the project as well. So we're going to be looking at these candidates, campaign professionals, journalists, and citizens in 4 countries. So we're going to look at Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the idea behind this is that these are very different institutional environments. And so if we can get a sense as to how the moral agency of these actors is shaped by their institutional context, then we might be able to come up with some useful ideas on how to create environments where actors can behave in ways that are most likely to enhance democratic norms and to improve political trust.
Right. Interesting. Really interesting. Okay. So perhaps we'll come back to that question of like what the impact of your research might be in a bit, and how you might actually be able to facilitate people to behave more ethically in campaigns. But I'm just still interested in that methodology. I was wondering about the focus groups. So I can see that there are advantages of doing focus groups, but do you think there are disadvantages as well? So I was wondering, like, that concern that you expressed about desirability bias, it seems like that might come into play more when you've got a focus group, because people are actually speaking in front of other people, and therefore might be more concerned about what they think and so on.
Yeah, so the desire that it is an issue, and again I think like one way of doing this is through maybe experiments, so like presenting scenarios. So something like Bill comes across a tweet online, and that is quite inflammatory, and you're not sure whether you agree with the sentiment, but you're not sure if it is a fact-based sentiment. Do you think that Bill should retweet this to his followers, right? So you can take the agency a little bit out of, or the sense in which the person feels themselves implicated, and get them to really kind of think a bit more about kind of the issue, and that will kind of reveal a bit of the structure of their moral reasoning. But there's also ways of designing focus groups as well that help. So people may have come across deliberative assemblies, right? So many publics are citizens' assemblies, right? Yeah. And the idea behind these citizens' assemblies is to get diverse people to talk to one another, because they bring different perspectives and different reasons to the table and so on. And there's a moderator there to try to help ensure that everybody deliberates together, right, and forms proposals. Focus groups, I think, should be designed a little bit differently, right? So rather than having a diversity there, I think it's actually best practice to have a relatively homogeneous focus groups. So you might have three. So you do 3 or 4 or 5 different focus groups, and kind of like some of a similar kind of education level. You might have an all-female one or an all-male one, and maybe some just mixed in different socio-demographic formats, depending on what you're looking for. And the idea behind this is that people tend to find that kind of risk of judgment much more when they're in groups with people who they feel they may have a sense of inferiority, or there might be issues there, whether it's racial issues, and this might be something you need to be sensitive to in the US. So having a more homogenous style focus group can really help fluency and honesty in these groups. So that's kind of like a important part of the design there, I think. That's
interesting. And then are you interested to some extent in what the differences between those groups might show? Because I suppose if you've got groups of relatively homogenous people who have whatever characteristics in common, then there might be interesting differences between what those.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a kind of a supplementary question that could be looked at, kind of like a nice little question you can pursue as a result of the design. Yeah. So certainly we'll be looking at that, but wouldn't be the primary reason for designing it in that way. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And I'm kind of particularly interested in. Well, I'm interested in all of this, but the question about kind of participants in elections, i.e. citizens, people who are going to be primarily voting in elections. So you were talking about, the kind of what they see as their duties and responsibilities might be. So could you just elucidate that a little bit? What do you mean by that? What kind of responsibilities do people have who are partaking in elections?
I mean, I think these are all kinds of duties I think you can think of in this context. I mean, one kind of duty is how much information you try to seek out in a campaign. Whether or not you try to consider alternative perspectives. Yeah. If you're kind of like just caught in a partisan bubble, or do you actually try to reach beyond that? Do you have duties basically to speak to people and to read people who you disagree with, You know, rather than just like, well, I'm a Republican or a Conservative or a Labour Party and I'm going to vote for them regardless, right? I mean, like, you know, what kind of what kind of, you know, deliberative duties do people think they have, you know, and even just kind of like, you know, the ethics of online behavior, right? You know, again, that example of, you know, retweeting things that you aren't sure is true,
or haven't
or,
read,
or haven't read, right? So I think we have
yeah.
these warnings, right? You know, have you read this? And you know, whether you like things and so all of these different kind of things that I think, you know, may seem small to individuals, like, you know, kind of what resource do they look at, but in the aggregate, you know, of course, if people are just not looking and not really engaging in the issue substantively, then that's going to cause problems for democracy.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting. I think we kind of tend to, when thinking about these things, we can tend to, like, everybody's very concerned about what the responsibilities of politicians are, right? And maybe other people who are kind of working with politicians, to some extent journalists and stuff, but perhaps that area of kind of what actually are the responsibilities of citizens is a bit neglected. And it's not an easy question to answer, right? Because, you know, in a way, if somebody's going to vote, for example, just based on vibes, is there anything wrong with that? You know, if you just kind of, you have a feeling about a particular candidate and you vote based on that feeling, are you doing something wrong there? Are you kind of not taking sufficient care to inform yourself?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, you know, the interesting thing is, what are the attitudes of those citizens, right? So there's all sorts of different ways of engaging more in elections, and, you know, we can find out what these. I mean, we have an idea as to what these kind of different modalities are, and there's an interest there in to say, okay, well, like, you know, what do citizens really think about the implications of how they are behaving, you know? And it might be the case that, you know, in a way that some citizens really just don't think about it, but even the reasons why they don't think about it can also be revealing in important ways, for understanding, you know, how they're really thinking about things and kind of the extent, because I think at the end of the day there's always some aspect of moral reasoning to these things, right? So you might say, oh well, somebody's just apathy or lazy or something, but it's never really that. There's always some kind of reason there in the background of this that makes them think that they are justified in just not caring, right? That right. You know, like, maybe they feel the system doesn't care about them, or that politicians speak in a language that's inaccessible to them, or whatever it is, right? So if you dig deep enough, there is going to be a value there, a normative attitude, a form of moral reasoning. So I think that's where it gets really interesting, is just when you dig a little bit deeper behind why people are, the value judgments people are making when they're making these seemingly unthinking decisions, but there's always something there, I think.
That kind of raises something that I was also going to ask. I mean, not just about citizens, but about all of these stakeholders, which is, I mean, presumably not all the reasoning that these people are doing is going to be moral reasoning, right? So there are going to be non-moral considerations which are going to be entering into their deliberation as well. So how can you... So are you interested in that aspect of what's motivating people as well, or are you just interested in the moral?
Yeah, so it will be necessary to kind of, like, you know, see the extent to which moral reasoning does feature explicitly, versus purely strategic goals, right? Because at the end of the day, they want to win the elections, right? Especially, like, even like maybe journalists, not as much, depending on what kind of journalists they are, but citizens and campaign professionals and candidates obviously have this kind of a stake in winning. So,
well, I mean, journalists. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, journalists do have other non-moral considerations which are going to be affecting what they're
true as well. That's a good point.
To do with selling papers
and so on. Exactly. Yeah. So I think there will be of course I think these will be some of the tensions there. You might call them you know, whether they could be self-interest or ideological considerations. These are things that I think can get in the way of you know, of actors being able to behave in accord with their other normative attitudes. So these factors play a role, but I also think that often in circumstances that there will be something behind, some value behind this that can be explored and prized out. Like, people often forget that, you could say that, okay, well, like, there's they might be doing, an actor might be doing things just for utilitarian reasons, right, or whatever, like, as if that's not a moral idea, right? But of course, utilitarianism is a moral idea, that you do that which is has the best outcomes, right? So I think when we're looking at some of this, some of the ways in which actors will justify things may relate to, especially when it comes to the strategic elements, may relate to utilitarian values. I mean, one example I can think of this would be, I think the problem of dirty hands is a good example, and I expect this kind of discourse to arise to some extent in the discourse, especially in more polarized societies.
Okay. So just for people who don't know what the problem of dirty hands is, could you just explain?
I will, of course. Yeah. So the problem of dirty hands is an idea in moral philosophy whereby an actor recognizes the validity of a moral principle or a norm, but is willing to explicitly override that moral principle because of some kind of utilitarian good, right? Something that that if they don't override this principle, that the outcomes will be unconscionable, will be so unpalatable that they have to actually violate a principle or a norm that they recognize as valid. Right. I think that, in more polarized societies, the stakes of losing an election are risen, okay? Because the guy who's going to be in office if you lose is going to be so different from you, whether substantively or even symbolically. These others are somehow just too far removed. You can't tolerate them in power. In which case, I think this raises the temptation to do anything it takes to win, right? To kind of like pursue strategies, whatever. Even if it's, you have to hold your nose while you're pursuing these strategies, because you say that no, what I'm doing might undermine democracy in some way, and might undermine political trust, especially if people find out that this is how I'm thinking or how I'm doing things. But I got to do this now because otherwise, this other guy or this other woman or this other person, or this other party is going to take over, and they're going to be so bad for the society that we can't just allow that. So I think in that kind of case, right, something that might initially just look like a strategic justification of going, we're doing this to win, can be really couched in a more utilitarian logic of no, like we're trying to do as those who speak about dirty hands say, we're trying to do right by doing wrong. Right. So I think this is kind of a good example as to how the separation between merely strategic reasoning versus moral reasoning, even though it's a relevant distinction, it's not always clear cut, and I think they interact in these kinds of complex ways, and that's one of the things we're going to try to dig out. And
because I mean, presumably there are some politicians who genuinely are doing what they're doing for purely cynical reasons, but assuming that's not the case, then you're working as a politician towards what you think is a morally preferable outcome, and therefore, that's always going to be an ethical concern alongside anything else. Okay. So another question based on this idea of non-moral considerations versus moral considerations. I was wondering, so you were kind of saying, well, there's always going to be some kind of value underlying everything, and I guess the implication being, if you kind of dig deeply enough, you'll get to the moral concern. But I was wondering, will you be able to tell like a rationalization from a genuine reason? So somebody, I can imagine somebody might offer you what looks like a kind of ethical justification for the course of action they're recommending, but actually it's just, that's just a convenient way for them to justify what they want to do for non-moral reasons. And I was wondering, is there anything in your methodology that will enable you to kind of tell the difference between those things?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it's an interesting one that will definitely have to be thought about. But I think it's very, very difficult to really have a reliable methodology, I think, to distinguish this. And this is kind of where the desirability bias kind of comes in. It's like, well, if they know that they have total cynical reasons for doing something, but then they say this, post hoc moral justification, I'm not sure how easy it is to be able to unearth that. But at the same time, I would say that the post hoc justification does indicate something about their moral reasoning, because I think nobody ever really thinks that, even if they're doing something for cynical reasons, I mean, nobody ever, I think, really thinks that they are just purely cynical, right? And that they're kind of like bad actors. Even though they might not have formulated a moral reasoning at the time of doing it, I think the way in which they justify things to themselves is how they keep up an idea of, I do have a moral sensibility and a moral justification, right? No, very few people really want to say that, no, I'm amoral and this is just what it is. So I think there is something, there is still something there that's real about their moral justifications there. And I think, we do have a tendency to think of politicians especially and these kinds of campaign professionals in a very Machiavellian way, like Dominic Cummings is a famous example recently of this kind of mastermind who is kind of doesn't care about morals and it's just about whatever strategy is there to win. And I think that this is a really in most cases a very simplistic way of thinking about it. And if you try to look at political candidates, for example, in a more empathetic way, and think about the situations they find themselves in, you might find things like interpersonal loyalty playing a big role in how they make their decisions, right? In terms of responsibilities, ethical responsibilities that they feel that they have to other actors, right? So and very often, like, these responsibilities are twisted in a cynical way. So we tend to think of like, oh well, a politician is just trying to satisfy their donors by pursuing policy X or Y, right? And there might be valid criticisms there in a particular case, but if you think about it, right, if you're running as an electoral candidate and all of these people have given you like €4,000, right? They've given you like hundreds, maybe even thousands of people have donated their money to you because they believe that you are a good advocate, right? And then people have volunteered for you, right? People have given their time to help you get elected. And your party has selected you and have shown faith in you, right? All of a sudden, like, if you think about this, I mean, this is you feel a sense of obligation to these people to not let them down. And all of a sudden, I mean, this might raise the temptations of doing things that you might not otherwise do, or you might be willing to relax your moral compass in certain ways, or to relax or to pursue strategies or forms of discourse that you might otherwise not do, or you may think is problematic, but you kind of feel like, well, no, I have to fulfill my obligations to these people who have put so much time, money and energy into me. So, I'm not saying that this necessarily justifies certain forms of behavior, but if we take this texture of the experience that these candidates have, I think this we begin to see a little bit more about how things work, and it might not be just cynical self-interest for why they do certain things. That it may be competing values that are at stake, right? The competing value of their obligations that they feel towards those who have helped them versus the responsibility that they have to uphold democratic norms, to establish political trust relations between all members of society, and so on. So I think this kind of like adds the kind of texture we need to be cognizant of to these things.
Great. Okay. Okay. So the next question is about what probably, I'm asking you to kind of prejudge the research to some extent, but just to speculate, kind of what do you think the outcomes of this research might be? What do you think you might find?
So I mean, I think some of the expectations I would have might relate to some of the points I was mentioning already. So if you this idea of a dirty hands discourse, right, and in more polarized society. So I'm expecting to find this maybe more in the US and perhaps in the UK than in Germany, for example. So that would be one kind of expectation. And then I think there'll be kind of a nuanced picture as well with regard to the role of things like I was just mentioning, like interpersonal loyalty, the role of ideology, the role of self-interest, and even the role of efficiency in as factors that can serve as motivations to behave in ways that might not be cognizant or consistent with actors' normative attitudes or forms of moral reasoning. The efficiency one is interesting because like you have if you have too little money, that can provoke different kinds of incentives to behave and in different kind of ways. Like maybe you only, in your micro targeting, you only target particular kinds of voters and you neglect a whole range of other voters. Or if you have a huge amount of money, you might do something you might have the capacity to engage in forms of political advertising on a mass level that can be more or less problematic. So ultimately, though, I think that overall I'm expecting a mixed picture to emerge, right? So that, like, when we're talking about the moral agency, we immediately think of judging negatively, or that's often an association. But I think there's ways of using big data and micro-targeting and party funding in ways that are actually positive for democracy and political trust. And I think by talking to the different actors, it may be possible to cast light on some of these positive dimensions as well in unexpected ways. Even when campaigns are run in ways that maybe seem to be damaging to democracy or political trust, it might not even have been the intention of the stakeholders to do this, right? They might express regret. Maybe an inflammatory campaign message that was only supposed to be a small part of the campaign, right? Just micro-targeted to a specific number of people. That maybe that kind of undermined, could undermine reasoned debate in a certain kind of way. But it was only intended to target a specific group of people. But then the media picks up on this and amplifies it and makes it the subject of discourse for weeks, right? And then the campaign professionals think, okay, this is not, we didn't intend to do this in a way that could cause such consternation, right? So understanding basically a bit more. I think my expectation is for nuance to emerge in all of these kinds of different ways.
Great. And are you hoping that your research will have some kind of positive impact in terms of influencing the way people behave in election campaigns?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the ultimate end of the project will be to have some kind of recommendations. I mean, these might especially have to do with institutional and regulatory reforms that might be needed. So, for example, there's been a number of scandals in Europe. Let's call them minor scandals with political parties violating the EU's GDPR legislation. So, for those who, I'm sure most people have come across it at some point, GDPR is this EU regulation concerning privacy protection. Okay, and there's a lot of rules about what you have to do to conform to privacy protection if you're collecting data on people. So there's been a scandal on this in Germany, even in Ireland. There was a small kind of one of the parties was having data it shouldn't really have under this legislation. So you might ask the question of what's the reason for that, right? Why did these parties kind of breach these regulations? Is it because the professionals have negative normative attitudes towards privacy, right? They don't really think it's that big of a deal, right? They don't care that much about citizens' privacy. Or do they think it's normatively acceptable to break rules, if you think you won't get caught? Or, do they have positive normative attitudes towards citizens' privacy and GDPR, but they actually felt under pressure to break these rules for some reason, whatever that pressure source might be? Or, did they just not understand the GDPR, right? And were ignorant of that they were actually breaking the rules. So depending on the answer to these questions, you might find support for different kinds of recommendations. Maybe greater enforcement or monitoring at the national level is required of the GDPR, right, to ensure that there's actually more of a stick for them not to break the rules. Or maybe the issue actually is just more transparency and more communication about what the GDPR actually means and what it restricts and what it doesn't restrict, right? So I think by having a sense as to what are the institutional and regulatory factors and other factors that kind of incentivize different kinds of behavior. If you have just a sense as to kind of like how is the wider environment structuring the moral reasoning, then we'll have a sense as to, okay, well, how can that environment be adapted to help overcome some of those limitations. Right. So that's one of the kind of the practical outputs of the project. Some kind of having our regulatory and institutional recommendations attuned to how the moral agents actually experience their life world.
Yeah. Okay, and how long is this research going to take?
It's going to take about 5 years, so it's a 5-year project, and we're going to be starting this September. We'll be recruiting a research team of mostly postdoctoral researchers, and so there should be between myself and the wider team should be up to 5 of us, going to different countries, doing the interviews, doing the moral theory, and trying to put it all together in a way that's coherent.
Oh, it sounds fantastically interesting. Maybe if we're still going in 5 years, you'll come back and tell us how it went.
Absolutely, no, I'd be delighted.
That would be great. Okay, well, brilliant. So thanks very much, Joseph Lacey. Best of luck with the research, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.